In the previous videos, we have seen how to define functions, how to call them, and then how to pass parameters and how to return values from the functions in Python. So arguments are basically the values, variables, or the objects that are passed to a function as input while calling the function. And Python supports various ways of passing these arguments to functions while calling the functions. So like it supports positional arguments, default arguments, keyword, and the variable length arguments. So, and again in variable length arguments, we have the keyword and the positional arguments in Python. Let's see how Python supports these varieties of argument passing in function calls and how they are helpful. Now let's try to understand what positional parameters are and how they can be passed and what is the use of these positional arguments in Python. So now consider this function, the calculator, which is defined with two parameters, and let's call this function. So when we try to call this function, so we need to pass two parameters because the function is defined with two parameters. So here I am calling this function calculator by passing two different arguments, that is 10 and 20, as the function is defined with two parameters a and b. So when we call this function, what happens is the value 10 is copied to a and the value 20 is copied to b. Here the arguments that are passed to the function are copied to the parameters that are defined in the function in whichever order they are defined in the function definition. Say for example here 10 is copied to a and 20 is copied to b. That is, the arguments are copied to the parameters in whichever order they are defined in the function. So such kind of parameters are known as the positional arguments. Here these arguments that we are passing are known as the positional arguments. So now let's consider another function call. I am calling the same function with the values 20 and 10. So now in this call what happens is these two arguments are copied to a and b, where 20 is copied to the parameter a and 10 is copied to the parameter b. So now we understand that the arguments we are passing to the function are passed in whichever order they are defined in the function definition. So here in this case 10 is copied to a and 20 is copied to b because 10 comma 20 are passed in this function call, whereas in this case 20 is copied to a and 10 is copied to b because we are passing the arguments as 20 comma 10. So that is, in whichever order the arguments are passed, in the same order only they will be copied to the parameters that are defined in the function. Now it's like I am calling the same function calculator with the parameters 100 and 200. Now so 100 is copied to a and 200 is copied to b. These positional arguments are copied to the parameters in whichever order they are defined in the function call. And we need to remember one more thing. So here in the function definition there are two parameters. So while calling this function, so we need to pass exactly two arguments. So here if you consider all these three function calls, in all these three function calls we are passing two arguments because the function is defined with two parameters. So here in this case 10, 20, here is in this case 20 and 10, here in this case 100 and 200. Now let's execute this function and see. So the function is executed with the 10, 20 as parameters, then 20, 10 as parameters, and then 100 and 200 as parameters. So in all the cases the function is executed without any problem. Now let's call this function by adding one more parameter. Here I am calling the same function calculator by passing three different parameters. Now let's see what happens. So here we are getting an error, and the error is the calculator takes two positional arguments but three were given. That is, actually the function is defined with two parameters, but when we call the function we are passing three arguments. So that is the problem. That's why Python is raising an error. So when the function is defined with specific number of parameters, only those many number of parameters we need to pass while calling the function. Now let's consider another example where the function is called with a single parameter. So now let's see what happens when I execute this code. So again in this case also it's throwing an error, and the error is missing one required positional argument b. That is, actually the function is defined with two parameters but we are passing only one parameter. That is, the second parameter is missing. So that's the problem with this kind of function calls. So Python requires, in case of positional arguments, whenever there are n number of parameters in the function definition, we need to pass n number of arguments while calling that function. Now in this case we need to pass exactly two arguments. In that case the function executes without any problem. So here you can see now the function executes without any problem. Whereas in the earlier cases when we called this function with three arguments or with single argument, so it raised an exception. So that is the problem. Now let's consider this function definition. So the function name is simple interest and it receives three different parameters. and inside this function, so we are computing the interest, so given the principal amount, time and the rate of interest. And then we are displaying all the values along with the interest that is computed inside this function. So that's what the function simple interest is doing. Now let's try to call this function, and whenever we call this function, so we are supposed to pass 3 different arguments. So here, as the function is defined with 3 different parameters, we are supposed to pass 3 different arguments. Whatever the first value that is passed as an argument in the function call, so that will be copied to the first parameter, that is 10,000 is copied to P, then 5 is copied to T, and similarly 7 is copied to R, and the function would be executed. So that is how the positional parameters in case of Python works. So in whichever order you are passing the arguments, and in the same order the values would be copied to the parameters that are defined as part of the function. So now let's execute this code and see. As there is no syntax error in the function, so the function executes and produces the output properly. Now let's assume that I'm not very sure about the rate of interest that is to be passed to this function call. This function is defined with 3 different parameters, where the first one refers to the principal interest, the second one refers to the time, and the third one is the rate of interest. Now let's assume that the rate of interest that is to be passed to the function call, so I'm not very sure. So in that case, can I skip this parameter and call? So let's call this function by passing 2 different arguments only. So here, please try to understand the function is defined with 3 different parameters, but I'm trying to call this function with only 2 different parameters. So is it valid? So as we already discussed, it's not valid and it will generate an error. So missing one required positional argument. And to help in these kind of situations, what Python does is Python provides the concept of default arguments. And what this default arguments concept refers to is, while defining a function, it is possible to assign a default value for a particular parameter. Here if you observe, to the last parameter I am assigning a value of 7. That is, whenever the function is called without passing a corresponding argument, then this default value would be used. So let's execute this function by calling all the 3 parameters. So let's assume that the function is called with 10,000 as a principal amount, 5 as a timeline, and 8 as a rate of interest. Now let's execute this code. So now if you observe, as all the 3 arguments are passed and these 3 values would be copied to the parameters P, T and R, and those values would be considered. So here principal amount is 10,000, time duration is 5 and rate of interest is 8. So as you have passed this argument and that value is copied and the interest is computed. So that's how the function is taken, when even if it is having the default argument also, whenever you pass all the arguments to the function, then so the default argument would be overridden. So now let's assume that I'm calling the same function by skipping the last argument in the function call. So simple interest function is now called with only 2 arguments. So now let's execute and see what happens. So here if you observe in this case, so P gives a value of 10,000 and T gives a value of 5, and what about R? So there is no other value that is passed during the function call, but in this case there is a default value that is assigned to this parameter. So that is how here if you observe, so the rate of interest is 7, is assigned with the default value, and with that default value the whole function would be executed. So that's how a default value can be used when that particular argument is not passed during the function call. So the default value would be used and the function would be executed. Now let's assume that I would like to provide some default value to the second parameter also. So consider this example where there are 3 parameters in this function definition and provided default values for 2 different arguments. And you need to remember one more thing. So whenever you provide the default arguments in the function call, and the default arguments should be towards the end of the parameters. So here if you observe, I have a combination of positional argument along with 2 default parameters. In that case, first positional parameters should come and then the default arguments should follow the positional parameters. Otherwise, Python generates a syntax error. So now let's see how this function can be called. What are the different possibilities to call this function, where there is 1 positional parameter and 2 default parameters. So now let's see what happens when I call this function with passing 2 different arguments. Let's execute this code and see. So here if you observe, so the principal amount is anyhow a positional argument, so it gets a value of 10,000. So time value is also passed as a second argument. So that's how the default value provided for the time is ignored and the argument that is passed would be considered. Whereas in the case of the third argument R, so there is no argument that is passed. So the default value provided to that parameter would be considered and the interest value would be calculated. So now consider another case where the function is called the only single argument. So now if you observe, both t and r are skipped. So of course this is also valid as there are two different parameters with the default values. So in this case it is valid to ignore both of these parameters t and r. So but p is to be passed as it is a positional argument. So now let's call this function. Now let's execute this code and see. So here in this case also the function is executed without any problem. The function can be called with providing the single argument, so that is a positional argument. But whereas the default arguments, so if you would like to pass, if you know the value of the argument, so you can pass, otherwise it can be ignored. So that is how Python provides the flexibility of either passing the arguments while calling the functions, or you can skip the arguments while calling the functions. By providing the concept of the default arguments, so Python provides the flexibility of passing parameters to the function. Now I hope you understand what the positional parameters are and what are the default parameters in Python refers to, and how they are helpful to skip the arguments that are passed while calling a function. In the next video we'll see the details about the other types of arguments that are supported by Python. Thank you for watching this video.